Thanks, Anne. When we met 10 years ago in June 2001, it was just after the EU summit in Gothenburg, attended by George Bush, where the police attacked demonstrators, held them in schoolhouses for hours and hours on end. It was also just before the G8 in Genoa in July and the killing of Carlo Giuliani. It was 2 months before 11th September. And so now it's perhaps an important time to reflect on where we've come from and where we're at and where we're going. To understand that, we have to go back before 11th September. We have to understand where we were before that date. Globalisation was well underway. By the 1990s, effects were becoming clear for all to see. And globalism, that's globalisation's ideology, was preaching and imposing free market, laissez-faire economics. State industries be sold off. And there should be no barriers to the free movement of capital and goods, while the movement of labour had to be controlled. By the late 1990s, globalism turned its eyes to the exploitation of the global opportunities in its control of technology. Its control of science was decisive. Technology, the application of science, would be used to create universal standards and systems, and of course to maximise profits at home and abroad. What stood in the way before 11th September to the universality of this development was in fact the political will, which was still constrained by a fading adherence to liberal democratic norms. And globally it was constrained. But the Cold War ended in 1989, and the Cold War was a political legitimation of the global capital, the economic. Global capital needed a political as well as an economic project. So 11th September came along. And it did change things. It was a trigger to release the potential for capital, the potential for technology, and the potential for domination. And it saw the emergence of an authoritarian state, legitimated, I would argue, by a veneer of democracy. And the interests of governments and states and multinationals coincided exactly at this historical moment. And the war on terrorism replaced the Cold War as a legitimating political ideology. Now, of course, we were told at the time that we had to have exceptional measures. We were told that terrorism would destroy our values and our democracies and our way of life. And yet we've learned that it was not that terrorism which cannot do this, but the reaction of the EU and its governments which can indeed destroy democracy and our way of life. After those dreadful bombings in Madrid in 2004, there was a massive emergency package. And we analysed that. We analysed the 54 measures. And 27 of 54 had little or nothing to do with tackling terrorism. 10 years on now, a dozen more measures have been adopted. But there's been no meaningful review. Those swathe of exceptional measures adopted, and we're told ad nauseam they're still necessary. And by the way, we balanced security and civil liberties. We balanced it. But we know, when we look at all that, the measures going through the implementation, that every time security and liberties are balanced, security wins out nearly every time. And what are these exceptional measures? The exceptional means they're time limited. They have sunset clauses, so they just disappear. What we know now is the exceptional has become the norm, but also the exception has come to define the norm. The kind of thing they want to sell us is the idea that in future all our cars should have a chip in it. The legitimation is, of course, if your car is stolen, you will know who it is, and it can be found for you. On the other hand, of course, it means they can track every movement of your car all the time. The answer? A chip in every car. There's no choice, as we so often hear. At another level, the exceptional powers are no longer limited, because when it started out, it was about terrorism. It quickly moved to terrorism and organised crime. But it has moved and shifted over time, so that measure after measure now, these exceptional measures, deal with any crime, however minor. At the moment, the Commission is negotiating in the United States for a general agreement on the exchange of personal information with the United States. You only have to look at Article 1 to look at the scope of it to know you're against it, because it covers any crime, however minor, and in the United States it covers also administrative crime, allegedly. This is where we've come to. So what I want to mainly talk about is who have been the main targets of the war on terrorism, the politics of fear. The first have obviously been the terrorists, the suspected terrorists, and those thought to sympathise with terrorism. As Gareth has talked about, suspected terrorists have been rendered, imprisoned, taken outside the EU, tortured, while indeed our governments in the EU sat on their hands and we learned little. What is interesting as it developed, of course, they weren't just looking now for terrorists and suspected terrorists and sympathisers for terrorists. They're now looking for people who apparently purvey radical messages. Radical messages. So these people are not given any criminal offence, but there's now a policy decision and a practice in the EU, with on each individual organisation with 77 questions. And what is the scope of this measure for law enforcement security agencies? The scope of this measure extends to the extreme right and left, Islamists, nationalists, and anti-globalisation, etc. There is no limit, in other words, about how far this could go. And of course the second group, the second target, were refugees and asylum seekers. Very quickly, on the 28th of September 2001, Resolution 1373 of the Agreed United Nations, it had an obligatory part and a compulsory part. A voluntary part. Everybody in the United Nations had to follow part one, but part two, member states did not have to follow. But the EU decided to follow them all. And that included the vetting of all asylum seekers to make sure they had nothing to do with terrorism. Now, how do you vet asylum seekers? You have to go back to the very states they're fleeing from to find out what evidence that state has against those people. So from the very beginning, we had the stigmatisation and the targeting of asylum seekers and refugees. And of course, in popular ideology, once you've got them labelled as potential terrorists, or potential criminals, or indeed people coming here with an economic drain, they become a target. This was followed by a swathe of measures. One of them was employer sanctions. So employers could be fined for employing undocumented migrants. But when you looked at the Commission paper and got inside of it, what you found was they were arguing there were 8 million irregular resident migrants, they thought. But 4 million of these were visa overstayers from the whitelist from Australia, Canada, Japan. But you see nothing later on targeting these overstayers, of course. It's only those on the blacklist for the third world who were to be targeted. In the same period, we had the infamous Returns Directive, which allowed the apprehension and return of undocumented migrants, so where this was not possible, to detain them for up to 18 months. And then next, we had a third measure, so-called legal migration. This is because the European Union has a falling working population. The EU therefore needs to recruit skilled labour from the third world to maintain its standard of living. Now, in my view, the EU is seeking to exclude and turn back those fleeing from poverty and persecution, but at the same time want to preserve its standard of living and its continued exploitation of third world resources and labour. I can think of no more immoral, unprincipled and inhumane policy when you put that package together. The third target is migrant communities. Migrant communities in Britain and across Europe, targeted for surveillance, for stop and search, special programmes like the PREVENT programme in the UK, which now extends to universities, teachers and doctors. But the Hunt for Radical Views also includes the recruitment by MI5 and Special Branch of covert human information sources, of spies, of blackmailing people who inform on their friends, creating a suspicion in communities of who you're working with. They're also embedded in local services, counter-terrorist police. So the whole programme is stigmatising, it fuels racism, fuels Islamophobia. And if you want to look at this, look at the publication by the Institute of Race Relations called Spooks and the reports of the European Race Audit. The fourth target which has emerged is the targeting of cross-border protests. This doesn't get as much attention in a sense, but it should. This started way back in 1999 with the targeting of football hooligans. Then after Gothenburg and Genoa in 2001, we had a police handbook on public order. In 2004, there was another handbook agreed on counter-terrorism at international events. And then outrageously in 2007, the two handbooks were merged. And this stated, the scope of the manual is now such that it applies to security, both from a public order point of view as well as counter-terrorism, of all major events, be it political, sporting, social or other. The contamination of the policing of protests and public order was contaminated by counter-terrorism measures. Of course, what does this mean? It means when a demonstration is planned in Copenhagen, all the other 26 member states get a questionnaire which they have to fill in 6 months in advance, 1 month in advance, 1 week in advance, giving great detail of the groups that are coming, their composition, the activist methods, as they call it, their internal organisation, their websites, their behaviour towards the police, their travel arrangements and their accommodation. And then liaison officers travel on the same way, and then when the demonstration happens in Copenhagen, they're pointing out the ringleaders, so-called, the leaders. And of course what you then got, which again doesn't have much publicity, is the concept of troublemakers. It's not good enough to have all these police arrangements. There's been a big debate, which we reported on, in the Counter European Union. They want to create a database of these troublemakers. The trouble is, when they looked at national law, discovered only 2 member states out of 27 actually had a national law which could cope with troublemakers. So they decided we'd better make it broader at one stage. Let's call it people disturbing public order and or endangering public security, sports hooligans, violent rioters, sexual offenders and repeat offenders. That didn't work either, so we thought it was dead. But it wasn't dead, because it was resurrected in the Stockholm programme, and now the Commission has to produce a proposal for a database dealing with troublemakers. What also happens in terms of public order in reality is not just tracking who is coming and what their views are and what their tactics are. It means that at the borders there's the use of Schengen Article 2.2 to stop and search at the borders, so they're never getting into the country they're trying to demonstrate in. Once you're there, of course, again there's a pattern again of preventative arrests. That is arresting people, holding them, so they cannot take part in the demonstration. Literally locking them up or keeping them apart and corralled for the duration of the demonstration. The third thing they're using, as we well know from cases of Mark Kennedy, is the use of undercover agents, covert information sources. And in the secret part, but it is on our website, of the 2007 handbook which I mentioned, at the suggestion of the United Kingdom, they're suggesting using undercover agents and covert information sources under mutual legal assistance, which is meant to be dealing with crime. But that, of course, as we now know, for examples, has become a practice. The third tactic is kettling. It doesn't just happen in the United Kingdom. It is happening again across European Union countries. And the dispensing of justice on the streets, the use of batons and tear gas, is also happening across the European Union. And the other feature is, there's very specialist units, the Carabinieri and the TSGs, are meant to be dealing with exceptional situations. They're now routinely used on policing demonstrations across the European Union. And the death toll mounts, as we know, from around Europe. The democratic right to free movement and the right to protest is under attack in a planned, deliberate way at national and EU level. And the fifth group who are being targeted is the rest of us, everybody in the EU, where we're all suspects and targets. The most obvious is mandatory data retention or telecommunications. And this is telecommunications, it's all your phones, faxes, emails, mobile phone calls and location. But in a sense, most dangerously, your internet usage. Because this isn't just communication data. If they're monitoring your internet usage, they're actually revealing the content. They know which pages you've been looking at. Then there's surveillance of travel. Surveillance of travel, which is 2 aspects. One is biometrics, that is fingerprinting, which we're not going to have in the UK, but believe me, they're going to have methods of profiling which will substitute for fingerprinting in terms of controlling our travel here. So there's fingerprinting, and there was a discussion which we got draw attention to about what age should children be fingerprinted. We managed to get it to become an issue. It was 14 at the time under the Eurodac system for asylum seekers. But in the council they wanted to be between the ages of 0 and 6. 2 member states, they said, well, we're actually starting it at 0. But we managed to get attention to that. So there was a compromise with the help actually of the European Parliament in this case, so it wasn't 14, but it was 12. Those little victories that one can have. There's another aspect of travel. That is PNR. Now, you cannot leave the United Kingdom and have a flight without giving your passport number when you book it online. They just won't let you travel. So the UK is already doing it, but the EU PNR scheme, following the EU-US PNR scheme, is initially about travelling in and out of the EU. And again, at the UK suggestion, this is to be extended from in and out of the EU and between EU member states. But what we know, because we've seen the background papers, that where we're headed under the table is for the surveillance of travel in and out of the EU, between EU member states and within every member state, and not just by air, but by land and sea as well. In very short terms, we're heading for a situation where surveillance of everybody's movement everywhere is being monitored. And if that isn't bad enough, they've got to pick up another US idea called ESTA, the European System for Travel Authorisation. You will have to get permission to travel. This is not a joke, this is things they're actually discussing. In everyday life, I would argue, in the not too distant future, we will all have one card, one state card, which will be our passport, ID card outside the UK, in the Schengen area, our health record, our driving licence, our access to e-government services, as they euphemistically call them. That is your doctor, your library, your school, etc. And heaven help you if you lose that card, or imagine if it gets withdrawn, that card. You will cease to exist. But I'm going to conclude, and it's a bit of a roller coaster, so there are statements, and I hope they will also come up in the workshops today, to try and pinpoint some of the scene changes over the last 10 years. We have moved into an era of capitalist globalisation where democracy is compliant to capital needs. We've moved from the Cold War, in the war on terrorism, to the death of civil liberties and the rule of law by 1,000 cuts. We moved to a world where states, national, transnational, European state, and multinationals proceed unhindered by democracy, unhindered by accountability and control. And with that, look at the excellent publications written by Ben Hayes for State Watch, Arming Big Brother and Neo-Panopticon, about exactly what is happening under no parliamentary democratic control whatsoever in the European Union or national level. And we've got a Europe too, where nationalists and racists and fascists have moved from the streets into the corridors of power, where the politics of informed consent, the old liberal democratic idea, is now a constructed consent, consensus, manufactured by the EU political elite, pronounced from on high and duly reported by compliant media. There are just two lessons. The first is we have to reclaim democracy. Because democracy is not about elections and political parties. It's a much bigger idea. It's about creating and maintaining a political culture, a culture of diversity, debate, dissent, tolerance, respect for other cultures, a sense of history, and an underlying humanity. This is what distinguishes democracy from authoritarianism and from fascism. It is freedom and liberty that define a progressive democracy. Fundamental values that transcend political systems. Democracy does not belong to the party policy of elections just to win them and keep power at whatever cost. Democracy belongs to us. And secondly, the second lesson is, too often the international and the European is not part of the national struggle. And the national struggles do not extend to European struggle, where civil liberties and people's rights and democracy are concerned. You ignore the EU at your peril. It's a powerful, dangerous, emerging state in the making at the moment. We need to bring the international and European struggles into our national local world. We need to move our thinking from the particular to the general to the particular, and both at the same time. The purpose of this conference is that together we can explore the issues and challenges and come to better understand the world in order to change it. Thank you.